We begin the show with Wisconsin freshman Republican Senator Ron Johnson, a major Tea Party supporter. Thank you for being with us, Senator.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Unemployment rate went up to 9.2% on Friday morning. Anemic job growth, obviously bad news for the economy. There are those that say, however, that shows what a sluggish economy it is, and as important as it is to cut back on spending and cut back on the size of government, that any kind of tight fiscal policy now would be a big mistake, and we ought to delay for at least a couple of years in order to get this economy back on track.
Well, I think the problem really is the uncertainty caused by all the government spending, and the fact that we've in just the last 3 years we've increased our debt and deficit by over $4 trillion. That's a 35% increase in our nation's debt since President Obama.
Well, you don't think if we cut now it could lead to a double-dip recession?
The problem is we're borrowing. It's not that we have the money to actually spend. We have to first put in the structural caps. We'll increase the debt ceiling upon certification that we've actually passed a constitutional amendment that will limit spending and eventually lead to a balanced budget, and let the people decide. Let the American people decide.
Let me ask you this. We're 3.5 weeks away from what the Treasury Secretary says would be a cataclysmic default. Do you think what are the odds now that we'll hit August 2 without any kind of deal?
Well, they're higher than they should be because this president did not engage until just last week, basically. I mean, to me, it is unbelievable.
Do you think there'll be a default?
Well, first of all, there's no reason for a default.
Right.
I mean, according to the president's own budget, if we don't increase the debt ceiling, we'll have to live within our means, which would be $2.6 trillion next year. Now, $2.6 trillion, just to put that in comparison, 10 years ago we spent $1.8 trillion. It totally covers all the interest on the debt, which is $256 billion. Right. It covers 100% of Social Security, which is $760 billion. That's $1 trillion. That leaves $1.6 trillion to cover about $2.6 trillion of expenditures.
Well, you've actually put out...
No, there's no reason for us to default.
And you have talked about a default budget, if we hit that.
Debt ceiling budget. Right.
Let me ask you this. Would it cover Chinese bondholders?
Anybody who owns, American debt.
So cover Chinese bondholders. Would it cover military pay and benefits?
Yes, it should.
All military pay and benefits?
It should.
Right. Would it cover drone attacks on the Taliban?
I haven't laid out the debt ceiling. I haven't laid out the debt ceiling.
These are important questions.
And I'm not recommending it. What I'm saying is I'm new here to town. I know how broken Washington is, and I issued a letter I sent a letter to President Obama saying it's irresponsible.
I understand that you're not advocating. I really do. I'm just saying if we hit that situation, you talk about a sort of a contingency budget thing, what it would cover and what it might not cover. Would it cover those drone attacks on the Taliban?
I'm a business guy. I've had customers go bankrupt.
Right.
We're basically dealing with an almost bankrupt America. So I take a look at this is secured creditors versus unsecured creditors. So I put interest on the debt, the debt service. I put Social Security. I put paying the soldiers, and specify some other things that would be the secured creditors.
IRS refunds.
They would get dollar for dollar coverage, and then you take the 1.6 versus the 2.6, and this is one way of handling it. Say we'll pay the rest of you 60 cents on the dollar until we reorganize, until we actually fix the problem. Okay. That would be one way of approaching the problem.
But IRS refunds might only be 60%, or Wisconsin farm payments may only be 60%?
For a couple weeks until we actually fix the problem.
Okay. If Obama agrees to a $4 trillion plus reduction over the next 10 years, that includes 3 out of every 4 of those dollars are on the spending side, significant cutbacks in Medicare in addition to domestic spending, and $1 trillion in added revenues. Could you support that if the components are right?
The devil's in the detail.
Okay. Now what I'm trying to ask, you wouldn't rule that out automatically because of revenues?
Depends on the detail. Again, I'm a small business guy. I never came to Washington for special tax deals. I'm opposed to those special tax deals, but not opposed to legitimate business deductions.
Senator Johnson, am I right in saying you wouldn't rule out, if the details were right, a package that included significant added revenues, if it was done correctly?
Again, we need more revenue, but we do need to increase revenue the old-fashioned way by growing our economy. Listen, we can't. Economic growth is the #1 component for a solution here. None of the policies that we enact should harm economic growth. Increasing taxes harm economic growth. Why would we do that? That would be silly.
1993, similar economy. Bill Clinton increased taxes. 2001,
it was not a similar. It was not even close to a similar
we were
economy.
coming out of it. It was the economy wasn't
not even
right.
close.
All right, 1993, Bill Clinton increased taxes. 2001, George W. Bush, massive tax cut. We created 23 million jobs. There's 23 million jobs were created under the Clinton administration. $3 million under Bush. If taxes are all important, why that difference?
In 2003, total revenue of the federal government was $1.8 trillion.
No, but give me the jobs.
5 years later, in 2008, it was $2.5 trillion. Had we taken Bill Clinton's budget at $1.8 trillion in 2000, grown it by the rate of population and inflation, we would be at about $2.6 trillion right now. The problem is spending.
Senator,
it's out of control spending.
You again, why were so many more jobs created after the Clinton tax increase than after the Bush tax cut?
Because jobs and businesses were created in the 80s under Ronald Reagan when he dropped tax rates down to 28%. No, I'm a living proof of that. I began my business.
So all those Clinton jobs are due to Ronald Reagan?
Absolutely. That is, those came from the businesses that started in the 80s when Reagan dropped top marginal tax rates from 70% down to 28%. Yes.
It's all due to Republican policies, nothing to do with Bill Clinton's policies,
You don't
right?
realize that. Absolutely.
No,
that's exactly what caused it.
You want to have a balanced budget. We mentioned that earlier, enshrined in the Constitution.
Yes.
You're a big booster of Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan's budget. 10 years from now, he would have a deficit under his budget of about $400 billion. What would you cut? What big programs would you cut to get there that Paul Ryan doesn't?
What we need to do is structurally reform the entitlement programs. And as I'm new to this political process, but as I went through the campaigning, I would ask younger people, and for me, unfortunately, that's 50 and under. What do you expect to get out of Social Security and Medicare? But without exception, the answer was always nothing. So what that tells me is there is a receptive audience for structural reform. It's not fair that people currently paying into the system expect no benefits.
So you would go further than Paul Ryan on Medicare?
Listen, Paul Ryan, what I support about Paul is he's acknowledging the fact that Medicare is the biggest problem we've got, and we have got to start structural reform.
To get to that balanced budget, you would go further on Medicare cuts, right?
No, we have to restructure the program.
Okay, but that's cuts. Restructuring sounds great, but that's cuts. It may be desirable, but it's cuts.
It's not necessarily to individuals. Okay?
Could be to doctors, could be to hospitals. You've accused Barack Obama of demagoguing. And yet members of your party still peddle this notion that Obamacare sanctions death panels. And you wrote a column a few months ago that said the single greatest assault on freedom in my lifetime, more than communism or terrorism, was the Obama health care plan. Isn't that the kind of demagoguery you accuse Obama?
No, because that's exactly what we're talking about. When government is going to decide what kind of care you can have, where you can get your care, and that is what
you think that's a bigger threat than communism?
That's exactly what this thing is leading.
You do?
I wasn't threatened under communism. I'm saying in my life.
You weren't threatened under terrorism?
Listen, I'm talking about things that are imposed on me by our government in America. It is the greatest single threat to my freedom, our freedom.
We appreciate very much you being with us today. Thank you.
Enjoyed
We look forward to further discussions.